Welcome back. So we are on to utilitarianism. So I would say the first two units of this course, we're dealing with sort of a collection of views that were important, right? We need to deal with the possibility that morality is subjective instead of objective, and try to make the argument that probably the best approach is to try to find some objective basis for morality. Then we considered a collection of possibilities for that objective basis. Maybe morality is um, rooted in God, right? Maybe morality is rooted in one's interests, right? One's own interests, and maybe morality is rooted in uh, an agreement. And we saw, some advantages, some arguments for those theories, and some problems with those theories. So moving on to utilitarianism, this is one of the big two uh, ethical theories. I'd say some of the largest groups of ethicists, philosophers still sort of actively believe in and try to support and argue for. And I think utilitarianism also represents one of the two sort of psychological proclivities that we have. Like almost all of us, a big part of our brain is utilitarian. We'll get into what exactly that means shortly, but I just wanted to flag that this is an important theory. Attention. So to understand the argument for utilitarianism, it helps to understand two different types of normative claims. So you'll recall we've distinguished the descriptive and the normative, right? So a descriptive claim is simply something like, um, you know, rain falls right to the earth and causes plants to grow. A normative claim would be that rain falls to the earth for plants to grow. Rain should fall to the earth, ought to fall to the earth, right? So these are distinct things. We saw Hume argue that you can't move from the descriptive to the normative, that those inferences are not valid, right? So anytime we're talking about how things should be or ought to be, we're making normative claims. But even within normative claims, these types of should or ought claims, uh, there are distinct types of normative claims. So sometimes when we ask whether we should do something, it's only sort of relative to a particular goal or end that we want to achieve. So if you were to go to UCSD, I originally made these slides when I was at UCSD. Um, Someone might say, "Oh, yeah, if you want to get to UCSD quickly, you should take Genesee Avenue, right? It's a street there in La Jolla." That's a sort of a should claim, right? It's telling you what you ought to do. It's not a purely scientific claim, but it's not like doesn't have any sort of deep moral import, right? We're not saying that it's morally right or wrong to take Genesee. It's what we call an instrumental claim. It's an instrumental sort of normativity. It means, it's relative to a particular goal you have. But if you don't have that goal, then there's, no reason Genesee, right? If you don't want to go to UCSD and instead you want to go somewhere else, then by all means, right? Don't take Genesee. We're not saying it's immoral or moral to do that. Pardon me. Um, so ethical questions sort of arise at the end of all these instrumental sorts of. Um, the idea is, what are you aiming at? In any day, you might be aiming at particular things for particular goals. So, why are you watching this video? Well, because you want to, understand the material. Why do you want to understand the material? In part to get a good grade in the class, maybe in part to become a more ethical person. Why do you want to get a good grade in the class? To get a degree, and so on, right? But if you keep asking those questions, well, why do you have that goal? Why do you have that goal? And so on, um, you're going to get to some more basic sort of good questions. And those are the ethical questions. Um, they're not necessarily different in kind than the instrumental sort of normative questions. They're the most general normative. So again, right, if I want to get to campus quickly, I should take Genesee. But you might ask, well, why should I want to get to campus quickly? And you might answer, you know, I want to get it, I want to make it to my final exam on time. But you might still ask, well, why should you want to make it to your final exam on time? Why should you do that instead of something else? And you might answer to get a good grade. Well, why do I want to get a good grade? to graduate with a good GPA. Why would I want a good GPA? To get a good job. Why do I want a good job? We could ask that, right? Not everybody necessarily wants a high-paying job. Your answer might be, well, I want to make enough money to be able to pay for my food and housing and some luxuries. But I can still ask, well, why do you want food and housing, right? Um, and you might answer, well, because I don't want to be hungry and live on the street, right? And I could still ask, well, why don't you want to be hungry and live on the street? And here you say, well, it hurts, right? Hunger hurts my stomach, and being on the street is cold or hot or dangerous, right? You could be attacked. And why don't you want to be attacked? In part because it hurts, right? So that picture on the previous slide was of J.S. Mill, and he offers a kind of argument, and you'll be reading the Mill, and we'll talk about him specifically a bit later, right? But he's making kind of that argument, and the argument is, if I keep asking, right? So, we have all these instrumental should questions about which street you should take and whether you should get a good grade and, why you want to have a good job and so on. When you get to the end of it, you're going to say something like, well, when I say, well, why don't you want to be hungry? You say it hurts. And there's not much sense in asking, well, why don't you want to be hurt? Right? That's sort of where the questions stop, at least Mill would argue. Hurting is just bad, period. And we don't have or need any extra reasons for why being hurt is bad and why feeling good is good, right? For Mill and for utilitarians, that's where these should questions stop. That is, the ultimate good is pleasure, and the ultimate evil is pain. So if I keep asking, why are you doing all this stuff you're doing? In the end, it's going to bottom out in, I don't want to feel pain and I want to feel pleasure. Right? So now we have a sort of a fancy but helpful and specific name for a utilitarian. Right? Utilitarian is a hedonistic act consequentialist. So what does that mean? So first of all, the act part means that, according to utilitarians, the sorts of things that are right and wrong are actions. Why are they consequentialists? Because actions are judged by their consequences, right? What makes an action right or wrong are the consequences it causes. And the consequences that matter are pleasure and pain, period. Right? This argument, or sort of this story I've been telling you about, like, I could ask you, keep asking you, why do you want to do that? Why should you want to do that? And you're going to keep telling me about consequences of your actions. Well, if I don't take the final, I won't graduate, right? That's a consequence, right? Action of taking the final or not. Uh, and at the end of the story, it's going to stop at, I'm trying to avoid pain. That's the general idea that utilitarians are shooting for. And it seems plausible enough, right? We don't like pain. We do like pleasure. Much of what we do is aimed at one of those two things, right? Avoiding pain or seeking out pleasure. And there's not really an answer to why pain hurts, right? I mean, there's some sort of biological answer, maybe, but it's sort of a basic one. Now, another important thing about utilitarianism, however, is that they're not egoists, right? So they're not just saying that your moral, right, morality, right and wrong, is about what creates pain or pleasure for you personally. They're saying pain and pleasure for everyone. Everyone counts equally, right? Not just you. So for utilitarian, the right action is the one that causes the most pain and the least pleasure for everybody in the world, right? So you can consider any particular action, and you might ask yourself, is this moral or immoral? And the utilitarian will have an answer for you. So maybe you're wondering, should I steal this shirt from H&M? For the utilitarian, what you don't do, consult the Ten Commandments, right? Or, what your parents told you, and so on. Instead, you think about the possible consequences of stealing that shirt, try to determine whether they'll produce on the whole more pleasure or more pain for everyone, and then be net pleasure, do it. Right? In fact, you're morally required to do it. If it's going to be net pain for everyone, then you're required not to do it. So, I mean, to pause for a moment and think about that, right? Stealing a shirt question. It's not at all obvious that the answer will be it's morally wrong to steal the shirt, right? Again, it's you have to take it on a case by case basis according to the utilitarian. And so you could ask yourself, okay, if I steal this shirt, well, I might get in trouble, right? So that would cause me pain, right? Um, but if I think I'm got a good chance of getting away with it, then maybe I could say, yeah, that's probably actually going to cause me more pleasure, right? I would have be able to wear a nice shirt that causes me pleasure. Other people will see me in the nice shirt that causes them pleasure. You might worry that maybe, one of the employees will get in trouble. But if you're reasonably certain that they won't, or that, it's obviously going to cost the company a little money, but, not very much, right? It might not even be noticed. So if you felt fairly confident that there wouldn't really be very many bad consequences, right? If you said, no, I'm not going to get caught, the company is not going to miss, whatever the couple bucks the shirt cost them, they'll be just fine. The employees aren't going to get in trouble, and I get the pleasure of this nice shirt. The answer might be yes, steal the shirt, right? Again, it'll depend case by case basis, but that's how utilitarianism works. So I said that they are consequentialists, right? They're kind of a specific type of consequentialist, right? And sometimes, uh, if you go on to read more ethics or even at other points in this text, in this class, people will talk about consequentialism more generally. So it helps to understand sort of how these are all related. So utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism, but consequentialism is a broader category. Consequentialists are people who think that morality depends on the consequences of your actions, right? But which consequences matter, different people have different views, right? Um, so utilitarians think that the consequence that matters is pleasure and pain, right? Some consequentialists focus on other consequences. A popular one is called preference satisfaction. You know, for example, if I'm a masochist and I enjoy pain, right, then uh, it might be for a different kind of consequentialist good for me to do an action that produces pain, right? So preferences are different than just pain and pleasure. Some people may have preferences that involve pain, and so, but for the utilitarian, the consequences that matter, pain and pleasure. Another kind of consequentialist that we'll get into is one that doesn't care about actions. Remember, we define utilitarianism as hedonistic act consequentialism. So the hedonism part is that they only care about pleasure and pain. The act part is that actions are the types of things that you're judging as right and wrong. But we'll see some consequentialists don't focus on actions and instead focus on sort of general rules. They say, well, if everybody followed this rule, would that produce on the whole more pleasure or pain? Right? So these three parts, right, of utilitarianism, hedonistic act consequentialism, are all separate. They can all be combined in different ways with different moral theories, but utilitarianism is a specific one, right? They care about actions, they care about the consequences of those actions, and the consequences they care about pleasure and pain for everyone. Right? Um, there's something appealing about this view. I mean, I think we all intuitively assume that, when I'm thinking about whether I should do something, whether it's moral or immoral, I am worried about the consequences for myself and for other people. And one of the important consequences is, I don't want to cause pain to people, and I would like people, right, to feel pleasure, be happy. Let's look a little bit at the historical basis of utilitarianism. So prior to the 19th century, so the 19th century is the 1800s, ethics and religion were like very tightly related. In fact, one of the philosophers, philosophers we read so far, Hume, was he had to disguise it in his writings, right? And never would never straightforwardly say I'm an atheist, but he basically, if you read between the lines, he was an atheist, right? And he couldn't get a job because of it, right? Sort of, he was a little bit independently wealthy and managed to put self-published books, right? It was really important that you believe in God, at the time in the 16, 1700s. And so on. Again, the idea, right? We're familiar with the natural law approach to ethics, right? The idea was God created the universe with a purpose. And if you want to ask, what should I do? You had to see, well, okay, what's God's plan, right? What was God thinking? But in the 18th and 19th centuries, we had a phenomenon in Europe called the Enlightenment. We had the scientific revolution. Gradually, religion started to take a back seat to logical inquiry, rational inquiry. And so it was in this context of the Enlightenment, the revolution, where you started to not have to bring God into every, theory or ethical discussion, um, that utilitarianism came about. Now, of course, there was a kind of a version of utilitarianism that's been around since the Greeks, right? That the Greeks kind of thought of everything at some point, right? So in many ways, we're rediscovering, but it became sort of prominent again. And so Jeremy Bentham, who in the upper picture there, that's his actual body that's like been preserved and put in his cabinet for people to view. I forget what university is that, Cambridge or something like that. And then below him is his student, Stuart Mill. They are the historical figures most associated with utilitarianism, and you will read some passages from John Stuart Mill about utilitarianism. So Rachel's offers us a few examples to sort of motivate utilitarianism. And again, what I say when I talk about motivating a theory, because I might, when you write your papers, for example, if you're um, writing a paper objecting to a theory, I might ask you to motivate it first. Give us a reason why anyone would believe it or what's appealing about it before you read it. So Rachel's tries to motivate utilitarianism, give us reasons why it's appealing and why it sort of agrees with many of our intuitions on moral issues, right? So he begins with euthanasia, right? So Sigmund Freud, the famous um, analyst, psychiatrist, uh, towards the end of his life, had terminal bone cancer. If you know anything about bone cancer, it's incredibly painful. His body was also sort of decaying and was giving off a terrible smell, so it was hard for people to be around him. Even his dog didn't want to hang out with him. Um, Flies were attracted to his body, so he had to sleep in a special tent. It was a bad situation for Freud. At a certain point, he asked a fellow physician named Max Schur to help him die. He wanted to die, and so Max Schur gave Freud an injection that killed him. Now, according to traditional Christian ethics, this would be considered wrong, right? Only, only God should be giving and taking life. And Schur did life, so technically this was murder, right? But we might still ask whether it was moral or immoral. Um, and if you think that, if you think it was wrong, right, then you're probably operating from a sort of general rule that says intentionally taking innocent life is wrong, right? Just a general principle. But we can look at how a utilitarian would approach this case. And if any of you thought maybe ending Freud's life was a merciful thing, right, and a kind thing to do, you might find that utilitarianism sort of gives an answer that better accords with your own gut feelings on the matter, right? So again, utilitarian in answering the question, should Mr. Schur, right, Dr. Schur, give Freud this lethal injection? We would have to ask, okay, what are the consequences of that action? Or alternatively, what are the consequences of not doing that action, right? What would the consequences be of letting Freud live? Well, he did have terminal bone cancer, so he would die relatively soon. And in the interim there, he would be in incredible pain. He would be isolated because, again, it was difficult for people or even his pets to be around him, and he wouldn't really be able to do much of anything. He also did ask to be killed, which is evidence that the situation was intolerable and on net more painful than pleasurable. Presumably, if he was still able to, get some enjoyment out of life, he wouldn't be asking to be killed. Okay, so those are the consequences of one action. It seems like a lot of pain. What would be the consequences of killing Freud? Well, less pain, right? Um, and his life was cut short, but that life was not likely to produce much more pleasure for him or for anyone else, right? So killing him doesn't necessarily increase pleasure a great deal, but it does get rid of a lot of pain, right? All of the pain between when he would have died naturally, right, in that moment. So it seems to be a benefit, right? At least we can go from sort of a net negative, alive and in a lot of pain, to sort of a net zero, dead without pain or pleasure. So utilitarian math, right, we prevented a fair amount of pain, even if we haven't produced a lot more pleasure. And if you can prevent pain, you should do it. And I mean, this is an actual, people have actually tried to work out this utilitarian calculus, right? Considering, the intensity of pleasure or pain, the duration, the certainty, uncertainty, how soon in time or remote in time it is, fecundity, meaning like how much more pleasure or pain it might produce, and so on, right? So I'm not asking you all to, calculus, but it's, I want to point out that it is um, a tractable problem. And often students will, um, this will be a common objection to utilitarianism that I'll hear from students. They say, how could you ever know how much pleasure or pain would be created? You can't really know. So, well, we can make very good guesses about the probabilities, right? And you go through life making educated guesses about the future all the time. So it's not so strange or wrong to think that you could make predictions about how much pleasure or pain could be produced by a certain action. So, as we saw, right, traditional Christianity would probably say that Freud was wrong. Utilitarians might be able to respond even on, the basis of Christian morality, right? Now, isn't God supposed to be benevolent, right? Doesn't he want his creatures to be happy? Why would he want Freud to simply suffer for no reason? So utilitarian might argue that their view is consistent with Christianity. But obviously, it's a controversial issue, right? Euthanasia is still legal. Of course, law and morality are different things, but at least we would like moral actions to be legal, right? So if you think that the moral thing to do would be Freud, then you would be motivated to say it should be legal. So this was, part of Bentham Mill's work, right, was to extend utilitarianism to a legal framework and work for um, changes to the legal system, right? If an action does no harm, for example, it's not just euthanasia, right? Various kinds of consensual sexual activity that were illegal at the time, right? Um, they argued that they should be legal, and homosexuality being one example, right? It was at the time illegal in many places, and Bentham and Mill said, well, let's look at a given consensual sex act. It seems to cause pleasure to the parties involved, and it's not clear how much pain it's causing to anyone else. So it seems like that is moral and therefore should be legal, right? So that's one example where it's up to you. Some of you may not share the intuition that you in Freud's case, right? But many people will, and for those people, utilitarianism will be appealing because it gives you the answer that you feel is correct. Here's another example that Rachel offers. This is about pot. So here's William Bennett. He was sort of in charge of the United States war on drugs throughout the 1980s, and he was very aggressive in his prosecuting drug possession. He actually had a PhD in philosophy, right? And when asked about the reasons for his policy, his answer was not particularly deep philosophically, right? He says, the simple fact is that drug use is wrong. And the moral argument in the end is the most compelling argument. So what he gave was a conclusion, not much of an argument, right? Maybe if you were to discuss it with him, he might be able to give you more reasons, right? Um, so yeah, don't turn in a paper that just says, X thing is wrong and that's it. Try to do better than William Bennett. Um, but he seems to be saying drug use is just wrong by its nature or something like that. Um, so whatever Bennett's reasons, we could ask, well, what would a utilitarian say about marijuana use? So utilitarians are not going to buy the claim that some things are wrong by their very nature, right? They have an answer about what makes things right or wrong, and it's about the pain and pleasure produced, right? We can run the utilitarian calculus on marijuana use. So in the pro column, right, there is pleasure produced, right? That's why people take drugs, is because it's supposed to feel good. That counts. All pleasure counts, right? All pleasure is equal, even if it's pleasure from drugs. And that goes in the as a goes as a mark in favor of marijuana. It causes pleasure. Now, are there some cons? Does it produce any pain, right? Um, Sometimes it's been claimed that drugs cause violent crime. That doesn't really appear to be the case with marijuana. It seems to make people more passive than anything, right? They're more likely to sit around and watch TV and eat food than to get up and rob a house. It's been claimed that marijuana is a gateway drug that causes harder and harder drugs, which do produce more pain. Again, that's an empirical question, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of support for that. But it's not to say that there aren't any problems with it. So some people do get addicted. There is such a thing as pot addiction. Um, and there is such a thing as pot withdrawal. It's not the most painful withdrawal compared to heroin, but it's not great, right? There are some unpleasant symptoms. Long-term use can cause some cognitive damage, and in general, it's just going to make you less motivated, right? If you spend all of your time watching TV and eating instead of getting out there and studying or trying to improve your life, that might result in over the long term. So there are cons. There is pain produced, but most of the pain seems only occur if you're a heavy user, right, or a long-term habitual user. If you're an occasional user, um, there is pleasure, and there doesn't appear to be a great deal of pain. Um, Now, these are just about the person using the drugs, but again, for the utilitarian, we need to think about pain and pleasure everywhere. So every action radiates out, to some degree, has effects on everyone else in the world. So small as to be negligible, right? But some of them are worth considering. Um, so what would happen, for example, we can consider marijuana legalization, right? What would happen if marijuana were legalized? Would that produce more pain or more pleasure? Um, presumably more people would use it and they would get the pleasure out of using it, right? Um, but maybe some people would become habitual users and would become less productive as a whole, and that would be maybe bad for society. Um, but one interesting uh, possible effect would be that since there may be people out there that don't smoke pot because it's illegal and they drink because it's legal, right? Alcohol is arguably a much worse drug in terms of its pain it produces, right? It is connected to violence and to crime and to bad health outcomes. Hangovers from alcohol are much worse, and so on. So, one interesting possible effect of marijuana legalization is that if it replaced some alcohol use with pot use, it may reduce pain and increase pleasure. And, the war on pot is fairly expensive, right? Some of that money could be spent on things, again, that produce pleasure for people, tax revenue. You would remove some of the funding that goes to criminals. Right. Pot dealers are all criminals, then you've got, money going to criminals. If the pot dealers are legal businesses, then the money is going to legal businesses. So Rachel's goes on, but I think we get his point, right? And it seems like at least in the state of California, they've sort of agreed with this sort of rationale. which is there don't seem to be huge downsides to marijuana use or legalization. And there do seem to be some significant upsides, you know, one of which is just that people find it pleasurable. Right? So, you know, you're welcome to argue against the way they're adding up, right? The effects here, right? You may think Rachel's missed some important downsides, right? Um, but at least, at a brief sort of cursory glance at the consequences of marijuana legalization seems to favor it from a utilitarian viewpoint. But you're welcome to, again, to respond to that and to critique that view, right? But if you thought that, yeah, marijuana is not so bad and people should be free to take it if they want and it should be legal, your instinctual, if that was your intuition, then it seems like utilitarianism on the face of it would give you that answer. And so for certain people, that's a point in favor of utilitarianism. All right, one more example. Non-human animals. So traditional Christian morality held that animals didn't have souls, right? That God created them for us to use, and that therefore it was perfectly ethical to kill or otherwise use animals in pretty much whatever way we chose, right? So, yes, eat meat, use them to pull plows, and if you had to punish, a cow or a dog by hitting it, or even had to kill it, they were beings that had a moral status. Some Christian theologists argue that being needlessly cruel to an animal was wrong only because it sort of harms yourself and it makes you more hardened and cruel, right? So really the only consideration was about animal cruelty was the effect on the These days, if you ask most people, right, people certainly who have pets, dog owners and cat owners and so on, they typically believe that it's not this clear-cut distinction between humans who obviously have souls and feelings and a mental life and animals that are just sort of like little robotic automatons or something like that. Most people would agree, and scientists would agree, yes, many animals are relatively intelligent, sensitive, they feel pain, they have emotions, experience fear, and so most of us aren't needlessly cruel to our pets, right? But many of us still do eat animals that are, factory farmed. They live and die under conditions that when you see them, and I'm not going to show you the videos or the pictures, but you can look them up yourself. It seems pretty cruel on the face of it. Maybe you have other sort of non-theological justifications for why it's okay to eat meat, or maybe you just don't think about it very much. But we can ask, what would the utilitarian say about whether it's right? Um, so first of all, for the utilitarian, it doesn't matter whether animals have souls or whether they have language or whether they're made by God or anything like that. All that matters for the utilitarian is, can they experience pain and pleasure? So if animals can suffer, then utilitarians take that suffering into account when they're making moral decisions. Now, it's not only the animal's pleasure and pain that counts, right? We consider the effects on the whole world. So if it gives me pleasure to cause an animal pain, right, by eating it or something else, the animal's pain counts and my pleasure counts. And it's really just adding it up. Right? So, if when you add it up, it turns out, oh, actually, right, eating, factory farmed pigs causes more pleasure on net than it would be moral, right? And there are lots of pictures that help you decide whether there's like pain involved, and I'll spare you those. You can find them yourself. But Rachel points out a few examples, right, of some pretty extreme stuff. So in Maryland in 1996, scientists used beagle dogs to study septic shock. They cut holes in the dogs' throats, placed E. coli into their stomachs, and within 3 weeks, most of the dogs had died. Okay, was that a great scientific achievement that we needed to know, right? That if you infect dogs with a disease, it will harm them. Did they have to do it in such a horrific way? There was certainly some pain for the dogs. How much benefit to humanity was there, right? In Taiwan in 1997, scientists dropped weights onto rats' spines in order to study spinal injury. Researchers found that the greater injuries were caused by dropping the weights from greater heights, right? Again, Pain to rats. Rats are relatively intelligent, certainly feel pain. Did it take a scientific study to realize that you can hurt a rat really bad by dropping a weight from a higher um, elevation? Not clear how much pleasure that generated, right? Certainly caused some pain, and so on. So they study alcohol by getting animals addicted to alcohol and then making them withdraw, and they have seizures and all this stuff. So we do all kinds of terrible things to animals, even just in scientific studies, where sometimes the pleasure is worth it, right? If I have to, cause pain to a bunch of rats, but I cure cancer, well then yeah, there's going to be definitely net pleasure there. But Rachel is pointing out there's a lot of situations where there's not any obvious benefit or pleasure generated. It's just a lot of pain, right? So again, um, same points that I. So most of us aren't involved in these types of experiments. Some of you may be, right? And if you go on to become scientists, you will probably have to think about the ethics of your experiments if they involve animals. And there's a review board that you have to submit your plans to before you're even allowed to do such experiments, right? Um, but the vast majority of us won't become scientists of that sort. But the majority of us do eat meat. Take as an extreme example, the treatment of veal calves, right? Um, so the point of veal is supposed to be very tender. So, a calf is born. They're taken from their mothers very young, placed in a tiny cage, so they can't move very much, right? So their muscles don't develop off. They can't even turn around. Like if they get a flea that's bothering them, they can't even turn around to get rid of the flea. The diet they're given, again, it's only aimed at keeping their muscles soft, so they end up with iron deficiencies and so on. And in general, imagine yourself, you're more intelligent and more sensitive perhaps than a calf, but calves can suffer, right? And you can imagine just being confined into a tiny cage for your entire life and fed an insufficient diet, how that would feel until you die. It would be a life of primarily suffering. And, there's other animals, maybe some of us don't eat veal, um, but similar things go on for pigs and cows and chickens. It's mostly for the sake of making the enterprise as profitable as possible. So we can run the utilitarian calculus on the issue of non-human animals. Um, Veal is delicious, many people would say, right? So eating it is pleasurable. It also provides nourishment, right? So if I didn't eat enough protein, I would be in pain. I would cause suffering, right? Um, there's a whole economy. There's people whose jobs depend on, right, raising and killing and selling veal calves, right? And that's pleasure for them. So there's certainly pleasure generated, and all pleasure is good pleasure, right, for the utilitarian. But the question is, does it balance out the suffering of the veal calf? And an important thing is you can't count all the pleasure that I get out of eating veal going in the pleasure column, right? I should only count the surplus pleasure. So if veal is like, wow, that's a 20 points of pleasure, but I could have eaten a nice eggplant parmesan that maybe would have been 10 points of pleasure, right? Then the amount of pleasure I can really count for the veal calf is just that extra 10 over and above the vegetarian meal, right? So is it is that marginal pleasure, right, of the veal over and above, a nice vegetarian meal, is that marginal pleasure greater than the lifetime of suffering? Maybe it turns out it will be, right? Maybe you really don't like vegetarian meals. Maybe you really love meat, and so much pleasure that it balances out the pain of the cow. But it's more likely that that's not the case, right? So it's entirely likely that the utilitarian is going to say you should not eat veal, right? It's immoral.